Okay. All righty. Hello, everyone. 25th of September. Warning ahead, we're going to be looking at weekly marks on Saturday. We're going to be viewing, and you could view it ahead of time, I suppose. It's already up. Lecture number 7 by Andy Higginbottom. Another fun lecture, 45 minutes or so. And of course, as you know, I put it on 1 1/4 speed to sort of speed up Andy. But anyway, that's available. Let's see what else. If you read the New York Times, Fred Jameson's obit for A.O. Scott, their film reviewer, did a little op-ed or whatever, an opinion, guest opinion on Fred Jameson. Even got a little couple of facts wrong, but anyway. Although I think Fred did spend some time at Santa Cruz, but he spent more time at San Diego than Santa Cruz, UC Santa Cruz. Anyway, right, Hudson 12. Michael Hudson, we're up to chapter 12. I skipped ahead a little bit. There was the earlier part of it is in the prior posting. I just repeated the 10 dynamics that led the economy to focus on asset price gains. And you can look at it at your leisure from the prior chapter, but these are kind of the elements that we see. They don't all have to be there, but in terms of the lead up to the 2007-2008 crisis, that's kind of what was going on. And, that the problem, of course, in a capitalist economy is you have all these different things going on at the same time. Marx spent his time trying to simplify some of these elements, make it easier for the average person to sort of understand. But the fact is, all of this sort of minutia or this convoluted set of arrangements that capital develops is part of the problem. Is creating new elements, instruments, ways in which you can hide wealth. Let's put it that way. And hide fraud as well. Deregulation leads to an explosion of fraud. As chairman of the Federal Reserve from 1987 to 2006, Alan Greenspan and Andrea, what's her name at NBC, blocked attempts by Andrea Mitchell, blocked attempts by board members to rein in crooked debt practices and put deregulators in charge of understaffed oversight agencies. By 2004, the FBI was warning about the explosion of financial fraud. But by not distinguishing between free markets and outright deception, Greenspan cleared the way for junk mortgage lending. And this just tipped the iceberg. I mean, folks who actually work in the financial industry know how problematic it is. Instead of protecting economies from danger, the disabled regulatory system protected bankers from being prosecuted. Fines were paid by their companies and hence stockholders or their insurance policies without acknowledging criminal liability. That's probably the biggest element. No comment on morals or ethics or all that other stuff. And of course, there isn't a discussion of usury, but in fact, the underlying elements of usury are the problem of the idea, the concept of usury. After Bank of America bought Countrywide Financial, its insurers paid the $20 million fine for the liar's loans dumped in the financial system by Angelo Mosolo. Citigroup, JP Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, and other banks paid millions of dollars in corporate fines to settle hundreds of billions of dollars of fraud by their managers. President Obama's future Attorney General Eric Holder set the benevolent tone for financial felons under President Clinton in 2000 when he negotiated the pardon of Mark Rich for his billions of dollars of theft. The deal looks suspiciously like a payoff for Rich's ex-wife lavish funding of the Clinton Library. And I don't need to tell you how complicated it is an amusing exercise, partially because it affected my ability to get a job, of all the people who got pardons at the end of the Clinton administration. Anyway, former officials and insiders are now stepping forward to show how crooked the regulatory system has become and refusing to prosecute the behavior that led up to 2008. But the Justice Department still refrains from holding specific individuals responsible or making them surrender the money they've taken. Apart from the economics profession not wanting to deal with debt or financial fraud, the essence of Wall Street's regulatory capture is to make sure that the agencies charged with regulating banking and the stock market is staffed with non-regulators. The junk mathematics behind junk economics. Myron Scholes and Robert Merton won the Swedish Central Bank's 1997 so-called Nobel Economics Prize for refining a mathematical formula for pricing options based on a paper that Scholes and Fisher Black wrote in 1973. It's a larger award. Scholes and Merton were invited to put their math into practice by running the long-term capital management hedge fund. 9 months after the prize was awarded, LTCM lost $4.6 billion and went bankrupt. Over $1 billion was lost in just 2 days of the September 1998 crisis it instigated when the stock market plunged 508 points. The fund should have called short-term debt leveraged management because its risk formulae assumed that any price changes would be merely marginal squiggles. In The Black Swan, Nicholas Taleb described LTCM strategy to be like picking up pennies in front of a steamroller, a series of probable small gains with only minimal expectation of a large loss. Such wipeouts always happen when bad lending occurs. But this inevitability was assumed to lie at the far tip of the bell-shaped probability curve. Nearly all of the major Wall Street firms were asked to contribute to LTCM's bailout to prevent a serious financial rupture in the web of computerized bets in which it had enmeshed the major Wall Street investment banks. Lehman Brothers refrained, for which it was duly punished in 2008. By that time, the largest bets hinged on whether and when the junk mortgage market would collapse. Lehman, of course, kept playing too long. Wall Street insiders saw the crisis coming and sought to profiteer from it. There was plenty of warning in the year leading up to the September 2008 crisis. The world changed on August 9th, 2007. That's when French bank BNP Paribas announced that it wouldn't let investors draw money from its subprime funds anymore. It couldn't value them because nobody wanted to buy them. It was a mistake, but it was nothing like the one that was to come. Hawks had convinced themselves that the financial crisis had been going on for so long that it wasn't one anymore. That banks had more than enough time to cut their exposure to troubled firms. That one bankruptcy, say Lehman's, wouldn't cause a cascade of others, or as St. Louis Federal Reserve President James Bullard put it, that the level of systemic risk has dropped dramatically and possibly to zero. Regulators not only turned a blind eye to reckless spending and fraud, they also sought to suppress warnings which threatened to lower the prices and profitability of bubble securities. Projecting the top Wall Street losers was the Rubin acolyte Tim Geithner, who's still at the Fed, who had joined with Wall Street billionaire and austerity promoter Pete Peterson, who recommended the young Geithner for the presidency of the New York Federal Reserve Bank. As Geithner wrote in his memoir, Stress Test, I basically restored the New York Fed Board to its historic roots as an elite roster of the local financial establishment. In a classic case of regulatory capture, Geithner reorganized its board to include a virtual rogues gallery of Wall Street players, including Lehman Brothers CEO Dick Fuld, JP Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon, still there, former Goldman Sachs chairman Steve Friedman, who is still on the firm's board of directors, and General Electric CEO Jeff Immelt. His position enabled Geithner to rescue Rubin's Citigroup and its bondholders from public takeover by bailing it out, pretending that the alternative would be chaos for the economy at large. When nominated to be Treasury Secretary in 2009, he assured his congressional questioner, Ron Paul of Texas, that he had fought against regulation. I have never been a regulator, for better or worse. And I think you're right to say that we have to be very skeptical that regulation can solve all these problems. We have parts of the system which are overwhelmed by regulation. It wasn't the absence of regulation that was a problem. It was, despite the presence of regulation, you got huge risks built up. Double talk. Geithner was much more than a mere deregulator. He defended the bubble and the New York bankers who engineered it against their critics after Bear Stearns collapsed on March 18, 2008. He assured the Federal Open Market Committee that there was no need for investment banks to set aside higher reserves. It's very hard to make the judgment now that the financial system as a whole, or the banking system as a whole, is undercapitalized. For Geithner, the real danger seemed to be not junk mortgages, speculation on derivatives or other debt leveraging, but those economists who are warning the public to get out of the market. There's nothing more dangerous in what we're facing now, Geithner accused, than for people who are knowledgeable about this stuff to feed the broad concerns about our credibility and about the basic core strength of the financial system. Geithner will play a major role in nearly all the remaining chapters of this book for his unrelenting moves to block any policy that might not benefit or might even curtail the power of the major New York banks. Acting as special protector of the rogue operations at Citigroup and Goldman Sachs in its claims against AIG, Geithner has been called the Albert Speer of the Obama administration, an apparatchik installed by Rubin and Larry Summers, to run interference against regulators and critics. Whether in Las Vegas or on Wall Street, the economics of a casino operate outside the logic of industrial capitalism. It is a zero-sum game in which fortunes are made from bets with counterparties and customers. Wealth is redistributed to winning bettors, not created. Indeed, the product is a pool of toxic mortgages. Timing in such markets is based on the moody winds of the trading floors in New York and Chicago. This is the time horizon of bank robbers and of robber banks. The idea is to get out safely before the peak is reached, because crashes occur quickly and sharply. All such crashes are triggered by fractures in the chain of payments. The fraud, embezzlement, or reckless gambling that trigger these breaks erupt like aneurysms, where the debt leverage financial service is stretched most thin. The highest debt leverage comes when there are no real assets at all behind the debt, Ponzi or Madoff styles in the 2008 crash. But the Fed was more concerned about rising wages than about prices rising for real estate and financial securities. Asset price inflation was applauded. Rising wages feared. The crisis was the inevitable result of the mathematics of compound interest and fictitious financial valuations. From January through mid-March of 2008, banks and brokerage stock prices fell by about 40%. But as long as the dancing was speeding up towards a final frenzy like Ravel's Bolero, standing on the sidelines would have meant letting rival money managers report better returns. The goal here was to take the money and run. As one trader told me, you only need to make a fortune once in a lifetime. For most players, this was that fortune moment, fueling the greedy turmoil leading up to 2008, after which housing prices would plunge by about 30%. Bear Stearns went broke on March 17, 2008. A tentative sale was arranged to J.P. Morgan Chase for $2 a share, but the Federal Reserve felt such compassion for Bear Stearns stockholders that it stepped in to absorb $29 billion of toxic waste losses so that they could receive 5 times as much. But when Lehman Brothers collapsed half a year later on September 15th, Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson told reporters that there was no way the investment bank could be saved. Stuck with the junk mortgages, Lehman Brothers had hoped to sell to pension funds and German Landesbanks. It would have been a travesty to reward stockholder faith in the firm's reckless behavior. Bear Stearns and Lehman were not like the banks where regular people keep their checking and savings accounts. They dealt with other financial institutions in the 1%. Until 1999, the Depression-era Glass-Steagall Act had insulated retail banking from such wholesale high finance in order to minimize risk to depositors. But Bill Clinton's brazen dismantling of this financial firewall enabled Citigroup, Bank of America, and commercial banks to become holding companies that included investment houses, insurance, and mortgage servicing firms, stock brokers, and real estate brokers. The facile promise of deregulation was that by letting banks do whatever they wanted, the financial system would operate more efficiently. The reality is that speculation and outright dishonest dealings have become more interwoven with retail banking, shifting the risk onto what had been relatively risk-free banks prior to 1999. The losses were concentrated along Wall Street's too big to fail high rollers, too politically connected to be constrained by regulators. Even banks with the most reckless or outright fraudulent operations were protected and bailed out. Subsidizing Citibank, AIG, and other institutions that lost so heavily that they otherwise were unable to pay the winning bettors and speculators kept the Wall Street casino afloat at public expense. Attorney General Eric Holder and Lanny Brewer refused to change the bank's real estate departments and mortgage brokers with falsifying documents. The liar's loan epithet was applied only to the low-income borrowers who put their signature on the mortgage applications filled out by Countrywide and other toxic financial polluters. The 10 million homeowners whose debts soared in excess of the market price of their homes, that is negative equity, received no leniency such as the banks received. They were subjected to a wave of foreclosures by robo-signed documents hitherto illegal under U.S. law, but which were permitted simply because the practice was so pervasive that to have enforced the law would have brought down the system. The system, quote unquote, was precisely what should have been brought down. The financial hijinks on Wall Street was not the economy, quote unquote. It was the banksters pretending that their interests collided with that or coincided with that of the economy at large. It was as if keeping debts in place preserved real wealth and employment rather than destroying them. A full court press was mounted to drive home the message that saving Wall Street's super rich was necessary to save the bank's everyday role of processing checks and facilitating payments for the 99%. But insured depositors were never in danger of losing their funds, nor were ATMs threatened with running out of folding money. The bailout was deftly constructed to save these large creditors, not the bread and butter economy. Declaring bad banks insolvent would have left their uninsured depositors, bondholders, and stockholders to absorb the losses from their bad loans. Self-serving declarations that the crash was not foreseen led to a pro-Wall Street response orchestrated under emergency conditions and public obfuscation. Bad debts and liars' loans were kept in place instead of writing them down to their inherent market valuations. This saved banks and their bondholders in a way that has imposed debt deflation on austerity from the United States to Europe. The assertion that keeping the debt burden in place was necessary to promote recovery is a textbook case of Orwellian doublespeak. The banks and their customers were saved at the economy's expense. The middle class is being crushed while markets are shrinking. Today's post-2008 austerity is the result. Debt service is being squeezed out via mortgage debt, student loan debt, and credit card debt. Real wages and markets are stagnating because consumers have little left to spend on after paying larger proportions of their income as debt service. Neoliberal economists claim that debt is not a problem and can be ignored because, as the saying goes, we owe it to ourselves. According to this chop logic, it all cancels out into a net zero balance in which one person's debt is treated as another's asset. This simplistic and misleading view neglects the whom dimension. Most of the net debt is owed by the 99% to the 1%. That is Wall Street ourselves. We owe it to ourselves. So it's not really ourselves. The credit that banks create adds to rentier charges, not to price and income stability, which is the whole point of it. 30 years of neoliberal junk economics has prepared the ground for imposing mass unemployment, emigration, and privatization sell-offs. The pretense is that public budget deficits cause inflation, but inflation has remained largely in check for the past few decades. What critics of government spending really oppose is public funding of Social Security, Medicare, and other social programs out of the general budget, including progressive taxes paid by the wealthiest classes. The hypocrisy becomes apparent when Wall Street praises public debt creation as governments create money to bail out banks. This asymmetrical pattern of debt creation is destroying our industrial economy and widening the inequality of wealth and income. Let me make the point today that Vice President Harris made an announcement about trying to change, or at least move towards a change in industrial policy and try to create more manufacturing in the United States, which is precisely the same complaint about, how the industrial economy got sold out by, this sort of financial service economy. The asymmetric pattern of debt creation is destroying our industrial economy and widening the inequality of wealth and income. It also is corrupting the economics discipline by suppressing awareness that today's financial and fiscal austerity is based on the deception that financial and other rentier free lunchers are part of the host economy rather than intrusive and predatory, and that today's austerity is neither inherently natural nor inevitable. It's just a result of financial policy that has almost fully captured the workings of governments. The remainder of this book, we're at the end of chapter 12. The remainder of this book, therefore, describes how the financial system has gained control of government policy throughout the world since 2008, freeing itself from public control and decoupling itself from industrial investment, except to finance corporate asset stripping. And as I said before yesterday on previous days, and I probably am going to write something on this. I haven't quite gotten there yet. I'm still reading the background articles. That the eradication of the Pacific 12 Athletic Conference, or its disintegration into something a lot less remunerative, and by selling off parts of it to the Big Ten, to the SEC, to the ACC, on the ACC and the Big 12, is part of a no different. It's no fucking different than no different than the financial evolution that has occurred, financialization crisis. Oh, and it was, yes, bad management. It was like people were having, Larry Scott, the commissioner, was having $7,000 lunches and crap like that. Chapter 13, the bailout coup of 2008, saving Wall Street instead of the economy. Sometimes I think people, this is Sheila Bair from her book Bull by the Horns of 2012. Sometimes I think people in the financial sector don't want you to understand the issues. Of course, if Main Street voters are confused or don't feel they understand the problems, they're unlikely to exert political influence to correct those problems. That only serves the purposes of the bad actors who do not want meaningful government protections against their risk-taking. Sheila Bair. The financial sector mobilized its forces in the 2008 banking crisis to convince the world that bailing out insolvent banks would restore prosperity. The deeper aim was to reverse the progressive tax system and financial regulation that had guided the economy since the New Deal. This sophisticated political con game has enabled the 1% to monopolize the recovery since 2008, widening their wealth and income advantage over the rest of the population. This wealth gap is not the result of any irreducible economic law of nature. It reflects the system of subsidies, tax favoritism, and bailouts crafted by the lobbyists and banking elites to counter most people's sense of what is fair. Speaking of what is fair, what's his name? Diddy. Apparently, Diddy and Sam Bankman-Fried are occupying the same multi-bed dormitory at Rikers Island. I guess they are quote unquote roommates in that context. It'd be just interesting to hear them talk to each other. The 2008 crisis afforded an opportunity to grab vast sums in subsidies by threatening that the alternative was chaos. There was an alternative, of course. It was for banks, bondholders, and other one percenters to take their losses as bad loans to be written off the balance sheets. But Congress kept the bad debts on the books, surrendering to the false threat of empty ATM machines and losses even on insured bank accounts. Pretending that it was not waging financial warfare, the Federal Reserve's idea of reviving prosperity was to reinflate a new bubble by providing nearly free credit to banks. While the Fed effortlessly facilitated trillions of dollars in quantitative easing for Wall Street, like it's doing currently, the Obama administration warned that Social Security must be cut back to balance future budgets. New money was to be spent only on financial securities, not tangible investment. Now, while the debt overheads, interest, amortization, and penalties reduced consumer spending and industrial investment, the banks foreclosed and transferred assets from debtors to creditors. This fostered a fiscal crisis, backed by coarse calls from Wall Street to solve it by privatizing public infrastructure and Social Security, like they're doing again, like Trump wants. Cutting social spending and scaling back pensions, the 2025 project. Whichever way economies go from here, they cannot return to the pre-2008 normalcy. So there can be no talk of recovery of the past, given the overgrowth of debts that just simply cannot be paid. Going forward, there are two alternatives. Either number one, banks and bondholders will lose if debts are written down, or number two, the economy will face a generation of austerity as debt deflation and privatization smother growth and upward mobility. In that case, the 1% will just simply inherit wealth, while the 99% inherit debt bondage, peonage. The financial sector's political mission is to replace democratically elected governments and public planning with technocrats appointed by the banks. The first 6 years of quantitative easing saw the Federal Reserve create money to bail out Wall Street, but not to finance tangible growth or demand write-downs of the household debt and the junk mortgages that triggered the breakdown. See, that's not built in to the current new plan as well in terms of the coming election, and it should be. The broad strategy of the banksters is to use economic distress as an opportunity to grab assets from the public domain, along with the government's taxing and money-creating ability. Instead of taxing rentier wealth and spending to rebuild infrastructure, federal and local governments are being pressed to sell public roads for buyers to turn into toll roads, much as they have transformed the healthcare system into rent extraction opportunity. How resolving the 2008 crisis differed radically from past resolutions. For a century, bank crises followed a well-understood pattern. Bad debts and investments were wiped out. Deposits in banks that made bad loans were reduced to whatever residual value remained after foreclosures, and distress sales swept away debt-inflated prices. Herbert Hoover's Treasury Secretary, Andrew Mellon, the Mellon Bank, Carnegie Mellon, etc., summarized the process in advising the president in November 1929. He said, liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate the farmers, liquidate real estate. It will purge the rottenness out of the system. High costs of living and high living will come down. People will just work harder, live a more moral life. Values will be adjusted, and enterprising people will pick up from less competent people. Until 2008, nobody expected that the largest Wall Street banks, such as Citigroup and Bank of America would comprise the quote unquote less competent people mentioned by Mellon. But financial lobbyists insisted that the special favoritism to these institutions was needed to prepare the way for renewed prosperity. Until 2008, financial crashes had a silver lining to wipe away the debt overhead so that economies can recover. Debt relief through bankruptcy traditionally forced housing prices to fall back to more affordable levels. But the Fed's aim and remains to preserve the economic power of the 1% and revive bank balance sheets by preventing housing, stock market, or bond prices from falling. Instead of the bad debts built up prior to 2008 being wiped out, they've been kept in place, like for people, the king of debt. In conjunction with cutting back public spending programs, this shrinks the domestic market and wages fall instead of the housing and other asset prices being supported. The banks were bailed out, not the economy. So, TARP. It's a TARP. Starting with the Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP, in the United States, banks throughout the world demanded that governments save large uninsured depositors and bondholders from losses and let managers of the broken banks keep the bonuses and gains they had paid themselves rather than, reorganizing the system. Ireland's government followed European Union advice to bail out uninsured creditors of Anglo-Irish Bank at taxpayer expense. In Greece, the European Troika, that is the IMF, the European Commission, and European Central Bank, saved bondholders by extending enough bailout credit to pay them in full for loans made to governments without any reference to the ability to be paid without plunging its economy into a worse depression that the country had suffered in the 1930s. Bondholders and bank depositors took their money and ran. Foreign debts to be paid by burdening populations with enormous taxes on a scale hitherto suffered only in war emergencies. The 1929-31 crash had led to government regulation and control over banking. The FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, was created in 1933. The Glass-Steagall Act separated commercial banking from speculative Wall Street investment banking, and other reforms were passed. But from 1987 to 2006, Fed Chairman Greenspan led the fight to dismantle the New Deal, disabling the regulatory oversight designed to keep bank loans in line with the borrower's ability to pay. After 2008, the bailouts preserved the most reckless and criminogenic mega banks headed by Citigroup and Bank of America, instead of letting them go under. A brief regulatory attempt, the Dodd-Frank bill, was undone by bank lobbyists who bought control of politics, supporting politicians who promoted regulatory capture to a point where financial fraud was essentially decriminalized. Instead of prosecuting financial lawbreaking, the largest banks have been let off the hook on the premise that enforcing laws against fraud would drive them under. Much as the key to the Sherlock Holmes crime story, The Hound of the Baskervilles, was that the dog didn't bark, the most revealing aspect of the 2008 bailout was that, contrary to what the Federal Reserve and Treasury avowed, the agencies did not follow the century-old Bagaho rule. Their emergency lending to commercial banks was not limited to the traditional goods securities at penalty rates of interest. Bank-friendly economists depicted this loosening of loan terms under emergency conditions as an effort to restore normalcy, but it was abnormal not to prosecute wrongdoers, as was done in the S&L scandals of the 1980s, when many bank executives were actually sent to jail. Excuse me. It was also a break from tradition to extend banks enough public credit to start lending again, without obliging them to wipe out shareholders and impose losses on their large, uninsured depositors and bondholders. So, therefore, a financial coup d'etat had occurred. Walter Bagaho was editor of The Economist from 1860 to 1877. His influential book, Lombard Street, A Description of the Money Market, 1873, was required reading when even I was taking my PhD in the 1960s. It outlined the strict terms on which central banks should provide liquidity in times of crises. It's all very Keynesian. Seriously bad loans back then were only a small portion of the banking business. And actually, in the INET, on the INET page, there's a couple of little appreciations of Idaho. The main problem was a general crisis prompting nervous depositors to withdraw their money from banks whose loans were basically sound. These loans went to debtors who were able to keep paying the carrying charges, but which the banks could not readily convert into immediate cash to pay depositors. Governments naturally sought to prevent economic crises resulting from banks having to call in their loans and drive their customers into insolvency, which is what happened during the Depression. However, central banks were not supposed to save insolvent institutions that had made bad loans to borrowers who could not carry their debts. Support for banks was supposed to be made on sufficiently onerous terms so as not to give them an opportunity to make speculative and predatory gains in times of distress. But by 2008, bad loans accounted for more than the entire worth of some banks. Many of these loans were fraudulent, for which banks would pay hundreds of billions of dollars in civil penalties. As a Levy Institute study describes, the Levy Institute is at Bard, which does a lot of the MMT stuff, the home of MMT. Government response to a failing, insolvent bank is supposed to be much different than its response to a liquidity crisis. The government is supposed to step in, seize the institution, fire the management, and begin a resolution. Normally, stockholders lose, as do the uninsured creditors, which would have included other financial institutions. However, rather than resolving institutions that were probably insolvent, the Fed, working with the Treasury, tried to save them by purchasing troubled assets, recapitalizing them, and providing loans for long periods. And let's do think this doesn't have predecessors. Certainly, there have been other similar crises, and I think that's what informed federal policy anyway, in the context of the military-industrial complex and the failure of large aerospace engineering firms, which happened a lot earlier. After banks had gained control of the Fed and Treasury, they turned Vagaho's law upside down. Henry Paulson's easy loan terms, like those of subsequent Federal Reserve lending, were a radical departure from the Vagaho rule. The Fed did not impose a penalty charge for being insolvent. The Fed, Congress, and Treasury provided credit at giveaway prices, giveaway rates to Wall Street's investment houses, as well as to normal commercial banks. The terms were so favorable that banks became the most profitable sector in the aftermath of the crisis. The Fed also lent against junk mortgages, derivatives, and credit default swaps at face value, or accepted them for non-recourse loans at prices far above what the market would have paid. The government absorbed the risk instead of banks, bondholders, and financial speculators. Quantitative easing, that is low credit interest credit to banks, tailored towards making speculation profitable enough so that banks could make enough money to compensate for the losses on those junk mortgages and risky speculations gone bad. It amounted to the largest American giveaway of wealth to favored beneficiaries since the Yazoo land fraud of the mid-1790s. Now, I know nobody knows the Yazoo land fraud, so I included it here. And, it's why very sleazy stuff occurred in the South and relative to land and the whole, or it's just this whole thing about land in the South, but that's another whole other story. I included it in here. It was a massive real estate fraud perpetuated in the mid-1790s by the Georgia governor and the Georgia General Assembly. So they sold large tracts of territory in what are presently Alabama and Mississippi. And you can see why Georgia is more important than Alabama and Mississippi by currently even to political insiders at very low prices in 1794. You know, even though there's sort of court stuff and Fletcher versus Peck 1810, court ruled that the contracts were binding and the state could not retroactively invalidate the earlier land sales. One of the first times the Supreme Court had overturned a state law, and it justified many claims for those land. So, you know, it gets sort of worked out, but these are at such a large level, and of course, before the Civil War, et cetera, that it's just absurd. And with respect, I assume if one reads the sort of the land law in Texas, it probably operates in a very similar way, as well as in Oklahoma et al. FDIC Sheila Bair, FDIC Chair Sheila Bair insisted that even the two most reckless insolvent lenders, Citibank and Bank of America, had enough reserves and sound loans to cover their FDIC insured deposits, even when the government more than doubled the insurance limit from 100,000 to $250,000. But Wall Street's strategy was to frighten depositors that they might have to absorb the losses if Wall Street banks and speculators were not paid immediately in full with no haircuts for the bondholders. As late as 2014, 6 years after the crash, former Treasury Secretary Geithner continued to claim that his insider giveaways saved bank customers from the alternative, that is, ATMs running out of money. This combination of a bailout of lenders while keeping bad debts in place was very far removed from a market-based solution. And this discussion about markets is actually the really important element. It's certainly the thing if you come by next week to the PERI conversation that Anwar Sheikh is going to have about his new approach to econophysics. You'll see that it's the markets are the really important element, which is sort of iffy relative to institutions. But anyway, it shows that banks hate free markets when they lose and demand that the economy needs to rescue them, not their debtors. You see, you'd think that everyone was sort of a free market, laissez-faire type, but that's not the case. It's never the case, in fact. That is why banks feel that they must control the government, turning it into a failsafe for their biggest blunders by absorbing their losses and serving their interests. Bankers also hate going to jail and insist that any fines for crooked behavior be paid by the banking institutions, i.e. stockholders, not the managers responsible for the transgressions. The Federal Reserve and Treasury provided credit under the guise that recovery requires banks to rebuild their depleted net worth so that they can make yet more interest-bearing loans to the already debt-ridden economy, pushing housing and stock prices back up, as if this is what prosperity means. And by year-end 2010, the financial sector did indeed recoup its heavy losses from 2008 to register about 30% of all operating profits, despite accounting for less than 10% of the value added in the economy. By mid-2013, the banking system's share of corporate profits had risen to 42%, and the Fed expects them to keep rising. But as Chapter 5 has explained, the consequence of this policy is that debt keeps growing exponentially until it engulfs the economy. Paying more interest and amortization on yet more debt leaves less to be spent on current output. What the debt-ridden economy actually needed was write-downs at the expense of bankers and other creditors. This was a great opportunity that government decision-makers vetted by the banks spurned in 2008. Banks recovered in a way that bled the non-financial host economy with austerity. And he's not even talking about the role of foreign banks in this whole business. Bailing out bondholders, not the debtors. The bailout process began on September 7th, 2008, when the Federal Housing Finance Agency, the FHFA, took over the $5.3 trillion of mortgage obligations held by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Founded as public agencies in 1938, these mortgage insurance institutions were privatized in 1968, but their presumed semi-public character led most investors to view their debt as implicitly having a public guarantee against default. This enabled Fannie and Freddie to borrow at interest rates nearly as low as the Treasury had to pay while buying mortgages yielding a much higher rate. By buying, insuring, and packaging these mortgages, Fannie and Freddie made them easily liquid and tradable for pension funds, institutional investors, insurance companies, and other institutional investors who got higher interest rates than were available on treasury bonds. Even foreign central banks were advised to hold Fannie Mae bonds in their dollar reserves. These investors assumed that Fannie and Freddie did the basic lending oversight, but in their managers' zeal to expand this business and keep their market share as Countrywide Financial and Washington Mutual led a race to the bottom, Fannie and Freddie increasingly bought fraudulent mortgage loans. It turned out to be easier to make profits without doing any due diligence at all, but simply to buy mortgages with no questions asked. Fraud usually is immensely profitable in the short run. Stock prices for Fannie and Freddie soared, and their managers paid themselves correspondingly high salaries and bonuses. Even investors who did not fully trust these institutions at least assumed that the government would pick up the losses from reckless lending. The government did end up on the hook for what turned out to be junk mortgages, although nowhere near as junky as the toxic waste packaged by investment banks such as Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers. The mortgage market finally caved in when Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy on September 15th, 2008. To save bondholders of Fannie and Freddie from bearing losses on defaults that threatened to wipe out the net worth of these two privatized institutions, the Treasury invested up to $100 billion in each to cover the losses on the liar's loan junk mortgages they had bought from Countrywide and other fraudsters. In exchange, the Treasury, the U.S. Treasury, received warrants, that is, options to buy 79.9% of each company's common stock. The CEOs and boards of directors of these two companies were dismissed, but there was no clawback to recapture the outsized salaries, bonuses, and stock options their managers had awarded themselves. The government also refused to risk the ire of stockholders by returning the two companies into public ownership. Instead of a takeover, the government's action amounted to a giveaway to save bondholders from suffering a loss. This was euphemized as saving the economy from socialism. But this was merely a dress rehearsal for the $750 billion TARP bailout in Congress. TARP was a total victory for Wall Street over Congress. It was all about the bondholders, Sheila Bair summed up when the dust had settled. The Treasury did not want to impose losses on bondholders, and we did. We kept saying, there is no insurance premium on bondholders, you know. For the little guy on Main Street who has bank deposits, we charge the banks a premium for that, and it gets passed on to the customer. We don't have the same things for bondholders. They're supposed to take losses. But it was financiers and investment bankers who were rescued, not homeowners, other debtors, and pension funds. Panicked Congress to pass the TARP bailout with no conditions attached, Treasury Secretary Paulson submitted a terse three-page plan for the Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP, on September 20th, 5 days later. Republicans voted against it, accusing it of being a move towards bigger government. Paulson's initial version left no room for congressional oversight, and Section 8 of his plan called for the money to be handed out without being subject to question by elected officials or the courts. Decisions by the Secretary pursuant to the authority of this act are non-reviewable and committed to agency discretion and may not be reviewed by any court of law or any administrative agency. This is another reason why the Trumpists et al., the right wing, wants to eradicate the administrative state, or at least to take seize control of it, which is what is designed in the Agenda 47 of Donald Trump. As economist Willem Buiter summarized Paulson's demand, I want $750 billion. I want it now. I will use these funds for good works, but I can't tell you what these will be. Don't ask any questions, and you can't sue me. Paulson asked for unlimited Treasury authority to buy or sell mortgage-backed securities up to $700 billion at any given time. The figure reflected Paulson's guess as to what homeowners owed the bank over and above their ability to pay, and above the market price for property pledged as collateral. The Treasury was to use the money to buy mortgage-backed securities on whatever terms the Treasury Secretary wanted, not only with commercial banks, but also with investment banks, hedge funds, and investment companies, without regard to any other provision of law regarding public contracts. The market for these securities was collapsing. Interest rate on adjustable rate mortgages was about to explode to third-year penalty rates far above the teaser rates that banks use to hook up to hook prospective home buyers. Instead of seeing market prices for their property rising above their mortgage, these debtors were losing their hoped-for free lunch of asset price inflation, what Alan Greenspan euphemised as wealth creation. Their negative equity position was deepening, leading to mortgage delinquencies and defaults, threatening bank profits, and some of the biggest institutions' insolvency. That was where the Treasury's main concern lay, not with homeowners or investors for the packaged junk mortgages Wall Street produced. Pressuring Congress not to add measures that could slow passage, Paulson said in a Sunday interview on ABC's This Week on September 21st, "We needed this to be clean and quick. And to be quick, this would be hard. It would be hard to think of a blunter illustration of Naomi Klein's shock doctrine, the rise of disaster capitalism. The crisis provided an opportunity for the tycoons of high finance to seize the initiative from Congress. On December 19th, President Bush used his executive authority to declare that TARP funds could be spent on any program that the Treasury Secretary deemed necessary to alleviate the financial crisis. In fact, not a penny of the $700 billion was expended on buying mortgage-backed securities. It was all a classic bait-and-switch exercise. The money was just given to Wall Street banks and investment houses that filed legal papers to become banks in order to qualify for FDIC support and other government handouts aimed ostensibly at protecting retail depositors rather than the 1%. Only the bad mortgage lenders needed a bailout, but to conceal Citigroup's identity as by far the worst offenders, the Treasury demanded that each of the 10 largest Wall Street institutions be gifted by a similar $25 billion sum. The money was lent on concessionary terms without any voice by Congress or any public agency over what these institutions did with it. Paulson warned that congressional pressure to provide relief for homeowners facing foreclosure would slow the economy, not rescue it. The biggest help we can give the American people right now is to stabilize the financial system, by which he meant his Wall Street constituency from suffering losses by having to sell their mortgages and other loans in the face of falling real estate prices. Some 4 million foreclosures were looming, prompting Moody's to forecast housing prices dropping by as much as 40% over the next few years, leaving families with negative equity, owing much more than their houses were worth, and hence more than should have been lent in the first place. To rescue banks from suffering from the market forces devastating underwater homeowners, the Fed bought packaged mortgages at above market prices. Instead of subsidizing homeowners, these cash for trash swaps saved banks from losing money. No significant mortgage relief was stipulated. Promises by incoming President Obama and other Democrats turned out to be just for show. Now, I don't even want to suggest that the Republicans, I think the Democrats were just as complicit in sticking the incoming administration with this idiocy. The Obama-McCain presidential debate sidesteps the TARP bailout, making an end run to the left of the Democrats. Congressional Republicans refused to vote for the TARP bailout, but John McCain fought to turn the tide on Friday morning, September 26th, the day of his first presidential debate with Senator Barack Obama. McCain flew to Washington to announce that he was spending his campaign to devote all his efforts persuading Congress to approve Paulson's plan. But the senator soon stopped grandstanding and flew down to Oxford, Mississippi to join the evening debate. Amazing as it may seem, and an index of how far the mainstream press failed to inform the public, no doubt to avoid enraging their audience, the TV questioners refrained from asking the candidates about the proposed bailout that had dominated the day's news. To fill the vacuum, that the media's self-censorship had created, the Treasury issued a fact sheet that Saturday evening promising removing troubled assets will begin to restore the strength of our financial system so it can again finance economic growth. By growth, it meant a new wave of debt. Hedge fund traders and banksters were depicted impersonally as the financial system, while the euphemism removing troubled assets meant buying junk mortgages at prices far above current market levels. This task ended up being performed by the Fed and not TARP. Senator McCain went on Sunday TV to explain it's not a bailout, it's a rescue. Insisting that no strings be attached, he saw his poll ratings plunge as his identity reverted from Maverick label back to his role in the Keating Five, the senators who had demanded that the Federal Reserve not interfere with Charles Keating's thieving at California's Lincoln Savings and Loan. Suspending proper S&L regulation had cost the government $3 billion. That was an enormous sum back in 1989. As Wall Street consultant Eve Smith points out, bailouts increase moral hazard by rewarding risky and reckless lending practices, and they're often the result of crony capitalism due to the power of the financial services lobby. So what we have here is a case of crony capitalism and kleptocracy, plain and simple. Whether by design or not is immaterial. And if we could just have entered that into discourse, into broader discourse, we would have been better off. But with a MSNBC poll showing that 62% of Americans oppose the bill, Republicans, but not McCain, struck a populist note and voted with righteous indignation against Secretary Paulson's open-ended giveaway on Monday, September 29th. This legislation is giving us a choice between bankrupting our children and bankrupting a few of these big financial institutions on Wall Street that made bad decisions, said Texas Congressman John Culberson. Denouncing the bailout as lunacy, President George W. Bush's first Secretary of the Treasury from 2001 to 2002, outspoken Paul O'Neill, called it crazy. The consequences of it are unbelievably bad in terms of public intrusion into the private sector. Former Republican Treasury official Paul Craig Roberts complained, under the bailout plan, the troubled assets move from the bank's books to the Treasury's books. In line with their rhetoric about free enterprise and self-reliance, they opposed handouts from government, that is, from officials on loan from their Wall Street management positions as being socialist. But waves of lobbyists descended on the Capitol to pressure Republicans to join the Democrats in a new vote. House leaders were reported to be bringing in the small business lobby and the banking lobby to buy the 12 Republican votes they need, convincing them that the TARP bailout was not really socialism after all. It was a case of socializing the losses, privatizing the profits. Mobilizing government to save Wall Street from losses on bad loans and gambles is the opposite of socialism. It is, in fact, oligarchy, control of the government by the wealthy. They were the largest campaign contributors, and Congress got the message. Denunciations of big government were appropriate only where public policy supported labor, not when it subsidized Wall Street. Despite the Constitution's rule that revenue bills must originate in the House, which had rejected the bailout, the Senate took it up and passed it by a vote of 74 to 25 on October 1st. Republican Senator Jeff Sessions, I recall the first AG of Trump, of Alabama, emphasized the few concessionary tax cuts to distract attention from the enormous giveaways to the big banks and brokerage houses, which were allowed to call themselves banks, quote unquote, in order to obtain Federal Reserve money creation. This bill has been packaged with a lot of very popular things to give it even more momentum, so that, as the New York Times explained, instead of siding with a $700 billion bailout, lawmakers can now say they voted for increased protection for deposits at the neighborhood bank, income tax relief for middle-class taxpayers. I hope you all remember when they started yakking about it. And aid for schools in rural areas where the federal government owns much of the land. 2 days later, Treasury Secretary Paulson called Sheila Bair at FDIC to meet at his office with the Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke and New York Fed apparatchik Tim Geithner on the phone line. Bair recalls indignantly how Paulson asked her to publicly announce that the FDIC would guarantee the liabilities of the banking system. They wanted me to stand up and say that the FDIC was going to be guaranteeing everybody against everything in the $13 trillion banking system. These liabilities would include all losses by banks, investment banks such as Goldman Sachs and their affiliates, which were quickly turning themselves into commercial banks to qualify for Federal Reserve loans, as well as for the TARP giveaway. The Treasury claimed that in order to preserve people's bank accounts, it was necessary to rescue large uninsured depositors, along with mortgage brokers, insurance companies, and investment banks. The implicit threat was to wreck the economy if lawmakers did not move quickly to save Wall Street. Baer rejected this policy. Besides the risk that it would have entailed, it would have also meant a windfall for bondholders because much of the existing debt was trading at a steep discount. Baer's major adversary was Tim, I have never been a regulator, Geithner at the New York Fed. Geithner did not want creditors, particularly bondholders in those large failing financial institutions, to take losses. She countered, we, the FDIC that is, do not have an insurance policy for big bond investors. They are sophisticated and well-heeled and can fend for themselves. There's no reason for the government to protect them. But the tide had turned. Later that same Friday, House Republicans put aside their rhetoric about free markets and gave the Democrats enough votes to save Wall Street, adding enormously to the federal debt, over which they would soon shed crocodile tears. President Bush immediately signed TARP into law as the EESA, the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act. Keeping Wall Street's mortgage claims above water involved creating new public debt that in due course would become the excuse for incoming President Obama to yield to Wall Street demands to define stabilizing the economy as cutting the budget deficit in some areas, in other areas, headed by Social Security. The TARP and other subsidies to Wall Street since 2008 thus created pressure for offsetting cuts to balance the federal budget in ways that have deepened austerity, the opposite of the act's pretended stabilization. It meant instability for the indebted economy. Debtors seem not to need rescuing, only creditors. Leading the fight to promote TARP, the Democratic Congress refrained from introducing safeguards to protect the public interest. No politician asked Paulson to define just what his idea of stability was or how Citigroup's, AIG's, or other Wall Street losses threaten the non-financial economy. The hardest questions, not surprisingly, came from Ohio Congressman Dennis Kucinich. He asks, why aren't we having hearings on the plan we just received? Why have we not considered any alternatives other than to get $700 billion to Wall Street? Why aren't we asking Wall Street to clean up its own mess? Why aren't we passing new laws to stop the speculation which triggered this? Why aren't we putting up new regulatory structures to protect investors? How do we even value the $700 billion in toxic assets? Why aren't we helping homeowners directly with their debt burden? Why aren't we helping American families faced with bankruptcy? Why aren't we reducing debt for Main Street instead of Wall Street? Is this the United States Congress or the Board of Directors of Goldman Sachs? All of these excellent reasons to ask those questions. And unfortunately, why Dennis Kucinich did not become president of the United States. Neil Barofsky, TARP's Special Inspector General, made a similarly harsh criticism of how the Treasury ignored even the modest care for debtors victimized by Wall Street that Congress supposedly intended. The legislation that created TARP, the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act, had far broader goals, including protecting home values and preserving home ownership. Congress was told that TARP would be used to purchase up to $700 billion of mortgages and to obtain the necessary votes. Treasury promised that it would modify those mortgages to assist struggling homeowners. Indeed, the act expressly directs the department to do that, but it has done little to abide by this legislative bargain. Almost immediately, as permitted by the broad language of the act, Treasury's plan for TARP shifted from the purchase of mortgages to the infusion of hundreds of billions of dollars into the nation's largest financial institutions, a shift that came with the express promise that it would restore lending. Treasury, however, provided the money to banks with no effective policy or effort to compel the extension of credit. There were no strings attached, no requirement or even incentive to increase lending to home buyers. And against our strong recommendation, not even requested banks report how they use TARP funds. Eve Smith points out that as soon as Congress passed the TARP bill, Wall Street changed how the money was supposed to be spent. The focus on toxic mortgage paper rather than the real intent equity injections was presumably to distract Congress critters and the public from asking, wow, if we're providing equity, what control and upside do we get? This is a way to avoid inconvenient questions like, well, why don't we cap pay? Fire the top executives, replace the board, and other things that are normally done with failing or failed institutions. The Treasury, the U.S. Treasury, gave the biggest losers, Citicorp and AIG, enough bailout money to pay the winning counterparties on the other side of their financial gambles. Banks quickly became the economy's most profitable sector. The administration insisted that their bondholders and large non-insured depositors not suffer a loss, and neither the FDIC nor Congress should nationalize ailing banks and run them as a public utility whose services might actually rival that of the private banking system. Preventing China from saving AIG 6 years after 2008, the lawsuit brought by AIG's largest stockholder, Star International, owned mainly by Hank Greenberg, finally went to trial. Testimony by subpoenaed Treasury and other officials revealed many options and fateful decisions hitherto concealed from the public and Congress. Gretchen Morgenstern of the New York Times found that the case's significance lies in the information it unearthed about what the government did in the bailout, details it worked very hard to keep secret. Now, the most remarkable revelation concerned the eagerness by China's government to buy into AIG on terms that would have made the Treasury's own $85 billion initial bailout, later expanded to $182 billion, unnecessary. That is unnecessary to save AIG, but not its counterparties, such as Goldman Sachs. That turned out to be the real problem. Asian sovereign wealth funds had been looking to invest their nation's foreign exchange holdings in something preferable to U.S. Treasury securities, not only higher yielding, but also in line with national economic development strategy. Of such global funds, the largest was CIC, the China Investment Corporation. It had lost heavily by buying into Blackstone Group's 2007 IPO. But AIG, after all, had been founded in China and hence offered that nation a chance to decolonize its FIRE sector. The Wall Street Standby institutional investor describes how CIC officials approached the Treasury on September 16, 2008, proposing to invest as much as the Treasury's $85 billion initial funding to buy into AIG. At a trade and commerce meeting in Yorba Linda, California, they asked Tyus Smith, Paulson's deputy chief of staff and executive secretary, to have him call Chinese Vice Premier Wang Qishan. The trials report of findings quotes her as saying, all the Chinese officials wanted to talk about was AIG. In fact, the document says Smith added that the Chinese were actually willing to put in a little more than the total amount of money required for AIG. Undersecretary for International Affairs David McCormick consulted with Paulson about the Chinese interests and then told Smith the Treasury did not want the Chinese coming in at this point in time on AIG. Paulson did not return CIC's phone call as requested by the Chinese government. A Treasury colleague was dispatched to tell the fund, in effect, to go away. Commenting on this evidence, one money manager told institutional investor, this was the epitome of crony capitalism. What happened was egregious, and the public doesn't know how egregious it was, and Congress doesn't understand how egregious it was. Geopolitics proved overwhelming. According to Duke University law professor James Cox, the savior of the financial system would have been a communist totalitarian country. The irony of the Chinese saving Wall Street would have been too much. The bottom line, Cox concluded, was a sinister or cynical way of protecting the big banks against the yellow peril. So AIG was saved in a way that benefited Goldman Sachs, and kept the U.S. control of its own FIRE sector while insisting on controlling that of other countries. The 2014 trial's big revelation was the degree to which Treasury and the New York Fed were more concerned with protecting Wall Street firms than with saving the government money or protecting the economy at large. It was all about saving the counterparties, as Chapter 16 will show. Any private buyer would have rejected the bold claims by Goldman Sachs for payment on the grounds that the mortgage securities being guaranteed were fraudulent. Paulson's treasury sacrificed AIG to Goldman as a kind of adjunct to TARP. Now, all of this means that, you know, there's shenanigans occurred. The economy did improve, but some people made out like bandits. That, you know, there was, and nobody paid the price. I mean, truly paid the price. There, banksters did not go to jail, and they still can go to jail. I mean, I would assert that a different kind of administration coming in would do that. In fact, assuming that the prosecutorial trope remains, this would be a good thing for a Harris administration. Anyway, all right, I finished this. Is there any comments about my yakking? Oh, Katie Porter would have made this all different. She just she just hates the contradictions like that. Yes, whiteboard 700 billion. Yes, laser fair for you, not for me. Yeah, you know, it's just it's not really socialism in that particular context. It's just greed. It's stealing the stuff. And oh God. Anyway, yes. Well, a good suggestion: mastering the universe, the obscene wealth of the ruling class, and what they should do with their money, and why you should hate them even more. Yes, that sounds like an excellent book. Other folks, anything else? Mansplaining.
Oh, I'd just add something on to that, Anne.
Yes,
It is that the ones that should have gone to jail but didn't were the
yes,
rating agencies. Like the rating agencies gave them all AAA.
yes,
And
yeah,
that's in the way that they got out of it was they said that was our opinion. And when you have hundreds of trillions of dollars being invested based on your opinion, that's a problem.
sounds like it's being rigged.
Well, the firms looking for the AAA on the ratings on the debt objects on the mortgage-backed securities would say, all right, if you don't give me the AAA, I'll go down the street to Fitch
Yes,
or Moody's, like when they
yes,
go to S&P. So they played the rating agencies against one another.
yes.
So that's the one that should have gone to jail. Like that's just,
Yep.
but they have good lawyers, and the lawyers
Oh, yeah. You know,
came up with that good defense, and that defense got bought.
yep.
So yeah,
It's yes, U.S.
yes,
economy at work.
yes,
Um, you know, and the way that you sort of get out of it is that if you drive the entire economy to be slightly more successful, some people just don't notice it, or you know, it's the stuff that you don't notice, the debt, you know, this monster debt.
yeah.
Because
Could
you
put a
only see little portions of it. Anyway, okay. Okay. I'm sorry it took so long. I wanted to get up to 13. Um, fraudsters. There are fraudsters. They were fraudsters. They're banksters. There are a whole bunch of banksters who should have gone the into the clink or something, or
That
paid
was
for in penalties. Someone asked a question about my presidential pardon. Wasn't my presidential pardon. Technically, let's see. I was going to get a new job to be director of an entire division at one of the SUNY campuses, but apparently, and this was, you know, so I'm in a meeting. I'm talking to the provost. Provost is saying, well, you know, this will all just go through in this our regular board meeting tonight. And I'm sitting around waiting to be, you know, shake hands and see you on Monday, and I'll start my new big deal job. Well, apparently, let's see, the president quit. Um, the whole board changed over, and I think they changed the entire. I've been at actually two places. I've interviewed for two jobs that were like that. It's on the same day where they overturned the entire administration, and it's just anyway. The background story to this is that in the Clinton administration, one of his pardons he gave to a bunch of rabbis who had been laundering money in New York, and their financial guy was the financial guy for this SUNY campus. Um, and well, he lost his job, but it all goes back to this continuing thing that's caused by the giving these rabbis uh, a pardon because they had parked money in a SUNY campus, and I'm thinking to myself, how they managed to do that? I just whatever. Anyway.
So, have you heard the author Rob Larson?
No.
I put a link to his book there in the chat. He was on KPFA being interviewed, and he was talking about the one percenters, and he mentioned Piketty too.
Piketty.
Yep.
Well, he's a French guy. I guess if he wasn't a French guy, he'd be more popular, whatever.
Rob Larson was also on the Majority Report a couple of days ago.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the title of his book is "If You're Upset with the 1%, You Should Be Even More Angry," or something like that.
Yeah, yeah.
That's a sequel. As the sequel should be even more angry.
I put something in the chat that shows the breakdown of where the wealth is. It's from 2015, but that's only 9 years ago. So, but you'll get the picture.
Indeed. Yes.
So,
thank you for that.
It's more than just the 1%. It's basically the 8.3% of the wealth. I'll put it in again. But yeah, it's really interesting.
No, I expanded it in the share. I think you can see it now.
Yeah.
Can people see that?
So you're saying it's the top 8%, Warren? That's the problem?
Well, that's global.
Global. Okay.
So globally, top 8.3% of 8 billion is 600 and something million people out of 8 billion. So, but then again, how many billionaires are there? There's probably, if I had to guess, I'd have to guess there's probably less than 10,000.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable.
You could just lock them up on their yachts, right? House arrest on their yachts.
But then they could fly away in their helicopter that's on their yacht.
No. Yeah, these would be prison ships. Anyway. Okie dokie. Thanks for that chart, Ward. I did go over time. I'm gonna cut the live stream so we can all swear. Thanks very much. We will continue on with this reading Hudson, but I will intervene with a variety of things and remind you that Saturday we're going to look at lecture 7 of the Andy Higginbottom series on volume 2 of Capital. And yes, I know that sounds boring, but it actually